evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Doctor Will See You Now. Hope everyone's well and keeping safe in these ever-changing times. I am so excited this evening because with us is an author that I only got to know 2 years ago, almost, doing Dr. Noir's travelling crime show in South Wales. And it was there that I had the very good fortune to come across and to meet Alis Hawkins, author of historical crime fiction and mysteries. Alis Hawkins, welcome to the consultation room.
Thanks so much for having me, Jackie. I'm thrilled to be here.
I love I love to meet every author in the surgery here, but when it's somebody that you've shared some really special times with, then it's got that extra magic, and I am just so grateful that you were part of those visits that we did to South Wales, and I know we're going to talk a little bit later about what is happening, what is cooking with crime fiction in Wales at the moment. But before we go there, it's important that we talk about you and what's happening with your work at the moment. So you are the author of, amongst other things, currently writing the Tyvee Valley Coroner Crime series. And for anybody who's not had a chance to get into Alis's work, that trilogy consists of None So Blind, In Two Minds, and the most recent publication came out this month, Those Who Know. And again, it's a wonderful step back in time to a most precious part of Wales. But we're going to be going into that in more depth in a little while, so stick with us. First, Alis, I'd like to probe a bit into your past. Now, I read that you grew up on a dairy farm, and I wondered, to what extent were you actually involved in milking those cattle?
Oh, to quite a large extent. In fact, I was home last weekend, and we were, as we always do in our family, reminiscing. And Dad was reminding me that I probably first actually started milking with help from him or Mum when I was 10. Certainly by my first year of secondary school, they were happy to let me milk the cows by myself while they went off and did other things around the farm, like haymaking and silage and all of that. So yeah.
Wow. I mean, those experiences, I think, that for so many of us just don't form part of our growing up. So I think that thing of being out in the countryside and being part of a working farm, quite an experience. But then education took you almost to the other extreme in a way, and you read English at Oxford. And I wonder, in those early years from milking to those those spires of Oxford, the thought of being a crime fiction author, did it ever cross your mind? Was that where you thought you were headed, or did you have other plans in mind?
I didn't really think a lot about the future, to be honest, Jackie. At that stage, I was very much a live for the day person. And as you say, I was brought up on this farm in West Wales, went to a tiny little village primary school, then to a pretty large comprehensive near home in Cardigan. And as time went on, my main aim was to get to Oxford, and I never looked beyond that. So once I got there, I just had a great time in Oxford, really, really enjoyed it. And then kind of panicked in my last year when I suddenly thought, oh my Lord, I have no idea what I'm going to do now. I didn't think of writing crime fiction at the time. I didn't particularly think about writing. That came a little bit later, once because what I decided to do after Oxford was train as a speech and language therapist, because I've always been fascinated by language. But it quickly became apparent to me that that was not going to be my life's work. It's great, it's an interesting career, but there was just a part of me which it failed to fulfill completely. So it was quite soon after I'd qualified and started working that I started working out what it was that I should write. And I started off with radio plays and short stories, and anybody who's read my books will realise that short stories was a terrible, terrible idea, because I do not have the gift of brevity in any way, shape or form. But it took me a while to come to novels.
Okay, just to stay at your time at Oxford, if we may, and being surrounded by literature, I wonder if you can I mean, was there a text that left a real impression on you? I mean, you must have studied so many, but is there one that stands out?
Do you know, there isn't. What stands out to me from my time at Oxford isn't the literature, it's the language, actually, because the course at Oxford is English language and literature.
Mm.
And I did as much on the language side as I possibly could within the confines of the course. So the things which really struck me were learning Anglo-Saxon. And when I say learning, I mean teach yourself Anglo-Saxon. They don't teach you. They kind of go, here is your primer. Here are the poems. We'll require a translation of the first one next week. Thank you very much. Right. Thank goodness I was a bit of a linguist. And I did the history of the English language, which was fascinating. I did papers on linguistics. So yeah, I tried to cram in as much literature, language in amongst the literature as possible, because what I discovered when when I did an English degree was I'm not very highbrow when it comes to my literature tastes. I liked the poetry. Poetry was great because you can, I'm not sure, can you have lowbrow poetry? Anyway, poetry was great. The plays were fine. I found a lot of the books and novels I was having to read just a bit too highfalutin for me, because I'd never been a great literary reader, if I'm honest. So no, I mean, the texts which really still stick in my mind are those Anglo-Saxon poems, that language which, oh gosh, when you hear people declaiming Anglo-Saxon, I mean, I'm terrible at it, but Seamus Heaney did a fantastic translation of Beowulf, that massive Anglo-Saxon epic. And the language which he used in that to convey what the Anglo-Saxons had been conveying with their very alliterative, non-rhyming but alliterative poetry was fantastic. So for me, it's always been about language, or it always was about language rather than story. I came to story in terms of producing stuff quite late, because when I was a kid I wrote quite a lot of poetry, and I tried the odd play for school because I was very involved in drama and all this, but novels came a bit later. A bit daunting novels, you know, they're big, they're long, you know, and I feel like maybe that's a hard thing to do.
and yet it seems to be now, from what I can see, that this is where you feel happiest, where you probably feel most fulfilled as a writer, at least for now. You mentioned, the Anglo-Saxon times, but when you do start to write those novels, you choose the medieval period, and I often wonder which came first, the chicken or the egg. Were you interested in that period, so you started to write there, or in thinking, I'm going to write a novel, I need to look for a period, I found one? How did it go? What was your process?
I was always very interested in the medieval period. I'm not a historian. I didn't even do history A level because I didn't like the course at our school. But I've always been fascinated by social history. You know, how was it for the common people, if you like? Not interested in kings and queens and politicians and military, but fascinated by the way ordinary people live. And I think it was partly that fascination with the history of the English language which anchored me in the medieval period, because it was during that period that English became, prior to about 1300, you and I would not understand what people were saying in England. Between 1300 and 1400, it became pretty recognisably modern English. I mean, most people can have a good go at understanding Chaucer, and he was writing in the latter half of the 14th century. And I think it was the history of the English language. It was reading Chaucer. It was reading around Chaucer. Tons and tons of stuff happened in the 14th century. It was, in many ways, it feels to me that the 14th century is the century which kind of set England, or set Britain, but mostly England, on its modern course. And also the medieval period, the pre-industrial period, has always been fascinating to me, because it feels like that's default human, if you like. That's what you can do without machines. That's what you can do without technology. You know, everybody has a kind of a craft which they do by hand. And that kind of high medieval period has always felt to me the most human period, if you like. I mean, I'm not saying that they got everything right. I mean, obviously their gender politics was horrible and their attitudes to anybody who was different was similarly disgusting. But from the point of view of the way people lived in the world and with other species, I guess. Maybe I'm romanticizing it a bit, but it's always felt to me like, wow, that was sustainable. If we did that with good gender politics and a kind of good appreciation of how different people are, that would be great. I could live without the internet. I could live without all these other things. But yeah, so the 14th century fascinated me. So when I started writing novels, I didn't immediately go to the 14th century because I'd already had the idea for the novel, which eventually became my first published novel, Testament. And I knew that I would mess it up if I did that as the first novel. I thought, no, I cannot waste this amazing idea on my first novel, because who writes a good first novel? I don't know, not many people. So I did a practice. And then I did that while both my sons were at home, I think. And then when my first son had gone to school and my second son was still at home and I was taking him to playgroup every day, I spent that time writing a sort of young adult book, if you like. And that's never seen the light of day. But having 2 books under my belt, I thought, right, now I can actually have a go at this amazing idea. And that's when I started the long process of writing Testament. So
wonderful. I have a question for you regarding the crafty period, shall we say, of medieval times. If you had to choose one of those crafts for yourself, what would it be?
Well, you see, I actually do one now. I don't know if you know this about me, Jackie. I'm a charcoal burner. My other half and I practice the medieval craft of charcoal burning. I learned how to do this. I know. I learned how to do this as a medieval book, which is the beginning of a trilogy, the Black and the White. Because for reasons best known to somebody who isn't me, I decided that the main person should be a charcoal burner, about which I knew nothing. So I read everything I could get my hands on, but then I realised that reading is one thing, but you need to experience these things. So I looked to see if there's anywhere in the country where they still did proper medieval, they call them earth burns. And I found one where we now live, in the Forest of Dean. So we came down, we spent a weekend doing it, myself and my partner, Edwina. And we were so taken up with the whole thing that we went on the road. We were then living in Canterbury. So twice a year, we used to come over to Kent, come over to the Forest of Dean in Gloucestershire, camp, and spend 72 hours on a charcoal hearth. Producing charcoal. So yeah, so I mean, I probably wouldn't choose that one if I really had to do it all the time. I'd probably be a calligrapher, a scrivener. I'd probably do that, because I did do a bit of calligraphy when I was a kid as well. So, but yeah, practical research.
Practical research, definitely. In that idea of how far can we go into the past? How far can we experience the past in order to be able to recount tales or form tales? And I mean, seriously, 10 out of 10 for the research there to be able to write things. That is tremendous. But if we move on a little bit, because I know we must, because we must come to this trilogy, which really, I think, and I could be wrong, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think it's this body of work that's really brought you, to public attention, and it's that work now that that you are beginning, to get the acclaim that I think you're due in the way that you write. So it's 19th century, 1850s West Wales. And there, you set this trilogy. It doesn't seem to me, and again, I could be wrong, but it doesn't seem to me to be the most maybe popular or the most typical either period or geographical setting for mystery or crime fiction. So Alice, the floor is yours. Why?
Well, any sane writer who wanted to be published would not set their fiction in mid-19th century West Wales, and it has been a struggle to get the books published, I'll be honest with you, or to get the first book published. I did it because I'd always wanted to write about a particular event in West Wales history, which is the Rebecca riots, which happened in the area in which I grew up, which is where the three counties of Cardiganshire, now Ceredigion, Carmarthenshire and Pembrokeshire meet. And without going into too much detail, there were a series of approximately toll gate riots. Farmers were rioting against the fact that many toll gates had been put up on roads which the local landowners had received acts of parliament to turnpike, in other words, to improve, and then pay for the improvements by making people pay tolls to go on them. That would have been fine, but what they did, these landowners, instead of concerning themselves with filthy lucre, they employed a species of person called a toll farmer to collect the tolls. So they basically sold the right to collect the tolls to these toll farmers. And there was one particularly notorious individual called Thomas Bullen, who had no scruples whatsoever, and he just put up endlessly more toll gates than were actually allowed for in each Act of Parliament, because each turnpike road had to have an Act of Parliament. And he also employed similarly unscrupulous people who'd fleece people at the gates. So the farmers were losing money hand over fist at a time when agriculture was in decline and people were not making much money, bit like now.
No, yeah.
Yeah. So to cut a long story short, the farmers finally rebelled, and using an old social justice technique called the Ceffyl Pren, which involved going out at night. I mean, English people might know it as rough music or riding the stang or the Skimmington ride. It's called Ceffyl Pren in Welsh, the wooden horse. So you collect together the local people who are wanting to put right an injustice, let's put it like that. They disguise themselves, so characteristically the men were dressed as women, the women were dressed as men, and they blacked their faces so that they were disguised. And then they would go out and they would right whatever wrong had been committed. In this case, they would go out and they would they'd subject these illegal toll gates to a mock trial, and then they'd smash them and burn them. So all tremendously picturesque. And this went on. It kind of, the first flourishing of the Rebecca riots was in 1839, and then it kind of died down because they got what they wanted. All the toll gates went away in that particular area. But then things got worse and worse over the next couple of years. And between autumn 1842 and late summer 1843, there were scores and scores and scores of these riots all over the three counties. So over a period of hundreds of square miles, obviously done by many different people. And this just isn't really talked about in Britain. It's the biggest, most prolonged, most picturesque, most interesting, most significant act of civil disobedience ever in the history of Britain, and nobody knows about it.
I wonder why.
Right, yes, it's West Wales. I mean, obviously everybody in West Wales knows about it, although it wasn't when I was at school, it wasn't on the curriculum. It is now, it's on the A-level curriculum even. But I wanted to tell a story about it because I thought, well, this is just fascinating, so people need to know. So I abandoned my beloved 14th century and fast forwarded 500 years.
I love the fact, though, again, you know, maybe a history text, I don't want to call it dry because I'm quite fond of history, but just a pure historical text might not draw in as many readers. So I love the fact that you bring to life, you know, this period through crime and mystery, and it means that, you know, I am sure many more people will get to think about these riots. I do hope it doesn't incite new ways of maybe. Or maybe I do. Let's not talk about that. We shouldn't.
Well, yes, about time we regain that spirit, I think.
Yeah, but I think we'll move on just in case we get closed down. But wonderful. Yeah. So let's stick in with the books. And to say about your main protagonist and the sidekick. Talk to us about them. Introduce us to them.
So my main protagonist, I've basically got a detective duo, if you like. So the character I had in my mind before I started writing the book is as it were, Well, yes, I suppose he's the main character with his sidekick. So he's called Harry Probert Lloyd. He's the son of a squire, a West Wales squire. He's only 26 at the beginning of None So Blind. But he's been forced home. He was a barrister in London. He's been forced home by blindness. He has macular degeneration. It's never mentioned that that's what it is in the book because nobody described it at the time, although they knew what it was. He actually has a juvenile form of it called Stargardt's disease, which I know lots about. So he's been forced home, doesn't really want to be there. He'd kind of fled to Oxford and then subsequently to London in the wake of the Rebecca riots, where he got ever so slightly too involved and kind of burned, as it were. So he didn't want to come back. He was making a life for himself in London, but quite difficult in the mid-19th century to be a barrister who can't see. So he comes home and he's sulking madly, basically. He doesn't want to be there. He's in a, as we would say where I come from, he's in a right puddy. And then he's been there a couple of weeks and his father, who's a magistrate, is away from the house. And a messenger comes knocking on the door wanting Mr. Robert Lloyd Sr., the magistrate, because human remains have been found. So Harry says, well, I can stand it, I'm here. Where have they been found? And the messenger says, on the next door farm. And Harry suddenly thinks, oh dear, I have a nasty feeling I know who these remains belong to. So he goes over and he looks, and there are various indications at the site of the grave that yes, this is the person he thinks, and he knows exactly who she is, and he was quite involved with her at one stage, and to some extent feels responsible that she has ended up dead. He didn't kill her, clearly, but he'd always wondered what happened to her, and now he knows. So he sets out to investigate her murder, basically. But because he's not been there for quite a while and because he's blind, he needs some help. So he goes to a local solicitor and begs, borrows or steals his clerk, the solicitor's clerk, a young man by the name of John Davis, 19 years old at the beginning of that book, who has his own tale to tell. And one of the things I like about None So Blind, or I liked about None So Blind as it kind of developed, and maybe we'll talk about process in a bit, was that it became clear that Harry and John both had history with this particular death, if you like, but they're not telling each other what they both know. They're doing this investigation together, and they're getting on quite well, but they're both keeping secrets. So in None So Blind, the reader is in a very privileged position because the reader knows exactly what Harry knows, but also what John knows, and so it's putting things together maybe before they do. So. Yeah.
I love this. I love this. Now, your choice then of a coroner, and I'm intrigued how somebody with failing sight can be a coroner. If I mean, what explain to me, because I really don't know. I mean, does the coroner deal with the body? No. Does the coroner just deal with the results of the autopsy? How does it work?
Then it was quite different to now. I mean, I have to say he's not a coroner in the beginning of None So Blind. In None So Blind, he's just doing an investigation. And then at the end of the book, he is asked to stand in as coroner because he's managed to make a really good job of this investigation. And the current coroner, who we meet in that book, is extremely unwell and unlikely to survive. So, and then in Two Minds, he's stand-in, and then in the one that's just been published, which I should show you.
You should come along. Hold that up. How glorious is that? That's brooding. That's brooding, isn't it? Wow.
I mean, the covers that the Dome Press have done for these books are just fantastic, I must say. So in those who know, in this book, he is on the election trail. He's getting elected as coroner. But to come back to your question, so in those days, coroners did everything from doing the initial view of the body, when they would then decide whether an autopsy was going to be done or not. And there were two sorts of post-mortem examination. Mostly doctors just came and looked and kind of did what you might call a surface examination. Very few doctors were willing or able to do proper autopsies, in other words, cut them up and find out what's going on, especially in West Wales. There weren't a huge number of extremely qualified doctors in West Wales at the time. Also, it was still, we're in the very beginning of the 1850s here, we're still in the period when autopsy wasn't really that popular. People still remember before the Anatomy Act in 1834, when the only bodies that were cut up were the bodies of hanged felons. You know, that's who doctors used to practice on. That's why we had the resurrection men, the people who would dig up graves to provide bodies for surgeons and for medical schools. So there's this feeling that there is something quite unsavory about dissection, if you like. And also there was quite a strong religious feeling that you didn't ought to do that. You know, that there was going to be this resurrection of the body, and you'd better have all your bits if you were going to be resurrected properly. So there was quite a strong feeling against autopsy at the time. So an awful lot of foul play was missed. Let's be completely honest about this, particularly poisoning, because poisoning doesn't often show a lot on the surface, potentially. So the coroner would go along and would, as they say, take the view of the body. So they would, the rubric for coroners, which had been around since the time of Henry II, under whom coroners first plied their trade. Coroner comes from the crowner, in other words, doing the duty of the crown. They were supposed to describe the number and depth of wounds. So you had to literally write down how many wounds there were, of what depth and length they be. So you literally describe the wounds on the body such as they are. And of course, Harry needs John for that. So Harry's busy listening to what people are saying. John is looking and describing and making notes. But then, of course, the coroner's main thing is to instigate, not necessarily do, but instigate an investigation if they decide there's going to be an inquest, and then actually preside at the inquest. Now, Harry is not interested in anybody else investigating, thank you very much, because he doesn't trust anybody else to investigate. I mean, the police were very, very new in West Wales at this time. So Harry's patch, the Tyvi Valley, includes bits of South Cardiganshire, Ceredigion, North Pembrokeshire and West Carmarthenshire. So he had 3 police forces to deal with. He has 3 police forces to deal with. Except the Pembrokeshire didn't have a police force then. They didn't have one until 1856, when it became mandatory to have a police force. So Carmarthenshire got their police force in 1843 and Cardiganshire in 1844. But they didn't really investigate. They were thief takers, really. They were keepers of the peace. The Welsh word for police, heddlu, peace force. So they were there to keep the king's peace, or by this point, the queen's peace. So Harry knows perfectly well that if you let the police try and investigate, they just won't. They'll kind of go, oh, no obvious wounds, no obvious motive, no obvious culprit. Oh dear, stuff happens. You know, Harry's not interested in that. He's interested in justice. He's interested, because of his experience in investigating Margaret Jones's death, because he desperately wanted to know what had happened to her. He kind of identifies with the families of people who've died and feels that they must want to know, as much as he wanted to know what has happened to Margaret, they must want to know what's happened to their loved ones. So he's a much more assiduous coroner than probably most, shall we say, because coroners, they were making it up as they went along at the time. There was very little job description.
And yeah, I mean, in a way, it must give you as an author a certain degree of free rein, in a way, to not be bound by.
Absolutely.
But I have to ask you. So in the 3 volumes in the trilogy,
it isn't a trilogy. It's a series.
It's a series.
I'm writing book 4 at the moment.
Joy! Rapture! Yes!
So about 3/4 of the way through book 4. So there we go.
This is blissful. Alice, you make me very, very happy. The Doctor is full of joy. There's more to come. Thank you. I had the question further down, but you've answered it. So it's great. So far in the series, the deaths or the mysteries that are there, have you based them on fact, or have you woven your own fiction in these stories?
They're completely made up. Completely made up. There aren't that many descriptions of coroners' inquests in this time, in this period. A lot of the records have been lost, such as they were anyway. Fires in buildings, floods in buildings. So there isn't a huge amount. I mean, I would be relying on newspaper accounts of the time. But to be honest, there weren't a huge number of investigations, I'll be honest. If you look at the statistics for the Tyvee Valley area at the time, it looks as if it was the most law-abiding place in the history of law-abiding places, simply because there weren't many investigations done. And I'm quite sure that that actually reflects not only, I mean, I think it was a fairly law-abiding place, but I'm sure there were many, many suspicious deaths that were missed because of things I've just talked about, but B, the local magistrates, as local government officials will ever do, were trying to keep hold of the purse strings and not spend too much money, and inquests cost money. So they invoked, and they weren't alone in this, magistrates were doing this countrywide, GB-wide. They tried to keep the coroners from investigating too many sudden deaths. And in fact, in the period that Harry is working in now, the Carmarthenshire magistrates had forbidden any investigations into accidental deaths. Now, as Harry says, how do you know it's an accidental death until you've investigated? So make your murder look like an accidental death, people, and you will totally get away with it. And people were getting away with murder, absolutely. So yes, it's a great period to set an investigation in. And because coroners, like I said, they were really making it up as they went along. There were very, very minimal guidelines as to how you should investigate. There were quite serious guidelines as to how you should conduct your actual inquest, you know, the hearing, put it that way. But in terms of how you went about investigating, you could totally make that up for yourself. So, and that's great for an author, because I can have Harry doing it as he likes. It's great.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now, let's come on then to the most recent novel in the series, Those Who Know. Yeah. And Harry gets involved in politics in this book, does he not? And not, I believe it's not that he wants to. It happens unwillingly in a way. Why did you take him into that? I mean, are politics important for you, and is that why you went that way? Or is it something that was happening in real life at the time, and so it was right that he should go down that avenue?
Yeah, no, the second, definitely. Coroners' elections, because coroners were elected in those days, they weren't appointed as they are now. Coroners' elections were often used as kind of tryouts for the local political parties to see what kind of level of support they could expect. So in Cardiganshire at the time, politics had for generations been quite sewn up, even though people had had the vote, or put it this way, landowners or large tenants had had the vote since the 1832 Reform Act. In Harry's area, that was largely irrelevant because there were never elections. They were uncontested elections because this family was always agreed to be the MPs for this region, and this family was always agreed to be. So in Cardiganshire particularly, you had the Howells of Nanteos being the county MPs, and they were always Tory. And then you had another family whose name I can't remember now, sorry. They were Liberals, and they would always be the borough MPs. So it was that town and county thing. And they were very, very rarely contested until the beginning of the 1850s. And then suddenly there was a bit more movement in politics, things were moving along, and people did start to contest. So I thought, right, we've got this election to coroner. It's the first time the coroner's been elected in a generation. You know, the guy who's outgoing has been there for a long time. So this is the first election that lots of people are ever going to have actually had the chance to take part in. Of course, the politicos are going to get involved because so this is happening in 1851. They were looking towards the next general election, which was happening the following year. And oh my goodness, the Tories and the Liberals, they really wanted to know how much work will we have to do to overturn the other people. So yes, so the Tories have nominated their person. So Harry, not having really understood any of this, suddenly finds a Liberal election agent banging on his door saying, "You need me. I'm gonna get you elected. Because if you try and do it by yourself, love, you haven't got a hope." Is dragged very unwillingly into the political sphere. You know, Harry naively thought that as he'd been asked to be coroner pro tem, that he'd stand unopposed for coroner. But oh no, the magistrates, they've seen how he does it. They've seen that he's woefully expensive, and they're putting somebody else up against him. So yeah, I mean, and that it was all very exciting. I mean, I'm not particularly knowledgeable about politics. I mean, I have a passing interest, not in historical politics, so I had to do quite a lot of research into that. But it was tremendously colourful and flamboyant, so that actually became quite interesting to me. So, yeah.
You talk about your research, and I wonder where it is. Where do you go and do it, Alice? I mean, can you do it all on the internet, or do you go? I mean, I suppose it might even be difficult at the moment, given the circumstances. But where do you get your information from?
Well, there's so many different aspects of research. So when I started None So Blind, I knew nothing about the 19th century and less about 19th century West Wales. So I had to do tons and tons and tons of just basic research. You know, what were the politics? What did people wear? What did they eat? You know, what were the kind of economics of the time? All this, you know, before I even focused down into West Wales and what was going on there. And that, I mean, there's plenty of books about that kind of thing. But once you get into writing about a very specific area, and each of my books takes place in a particular little town or village, so you've got to know tons of stuff about that there, what was happening there, what's the historical context there, you know. So then I find the internet is brilliant for pointing me in the direction of things like newspapers at the time, and thank goodness the National Library of Wales has now digitised, well, probably by this point, millions of newspapers. So as long as you've got some good keyword searches, you can find lots of stuff. And my goodness, that's a rabbit hole to disappear down. I mean, looking at the front page of The Welshman, or the two papers that have been really key for me have been The Welshman and the Carmarthen and South Wales Journal. My goodness, just fascinating, the kind of stuff that you come up with. But also the other key source texts for me have been unpublished PhD theses. Oh my goodness, they are brilliant, because they're always, well, you know what a PhD thesis is, always about something highly specific. So I've got probably 5 or 6 by this point, unpublished PhD theses, which I've printed out, and I've devoured them. One told me everything I now know pretty much about what it was like to be a coroner in the 19th century, written by a fantastic woman from Leicester University called Pam Fisher. In fact, I acknowledge her in the first book, because I don't know where I would have got my information from if it wasn't for her, because there's not a lot written about coroners at the time. And for the book I'm writing now, there's this fantastic PhD thesis by somebody from Swansea University about the role of women in the agricultural society of South Cardiganshire. I mean, how perfect is that? It's just absolutely fantastic.
It's wonderful. But you know, from the other side, I can imagine, because as you say, very often, you know, PhD, the subject matter is so specific. The actual audience that you're ever going to have for a PhD is usually quite limited. So when somebody comes along and says, "You've given me everything I needed to write this,"
oh no, absolutely.
yeah,
Yes.
fabulous, fabulous.
I wish I was quite pleased. So yeah, they're absolutely fantastic. And of course, books. I mean, I've got endless books on my shelves behind me. So yeah, it's a multitude of different places, really. And then, of course, you have to go there. You have to go there, because although aspects of the landscape will have changed, your roads will look a bit different, the buildings are now quite different, the landscape is the same. The feel of the weather is the same. There's less water because of drainage and stuff, but yeah, so I always go and wander around and what have you. The first book, I didn't have to do that much because it's all set pretty much in the village where I grew up, so that was all right. But subsequent books, I've gone and done the whole thing.
Wonderful. I don't know. So 3 books in, and I wonder how the partnership is doing. How have they progressed together? I mean, are they, because initially in that first book, they don't tell each other.
Absolutely.
You know, so, I mean, Are they, are they more willing to share things that they might know now? Are they closer, or do they still keep each other at arm's length?
Well, it's a work in progress, Harry and John's relationship. And because they keep, I mean, it changes, their circumstances change as the books go along, and they start working much more closely together. And that both makes things easier, but also more difficult. Because all the while that John can walk away, while he's still being a solicitor's clerk and Harry's just borrowing him, then he can pretty well say, well, he can say what he likes to Harry, if you like, within the constraints of their social whatever. But once he starts working for Harry, and that happens in the second book, or the suggestion of it happens in the second book, suddenly he can't walk away anymore. He can't just go back to Mr. Schofield, his employer. He's now got to toe the line a bit more. So although he's been elevated in social status, actually he feels slightly less equal than he did before, which is interesting. And in terms of, do they talk about stuff, I think they're more prepared to talk about the case now and to share things about the case. But now they're sharing a bit more of their lives together. Oh, it's all become quite complicated. And of course, then we introduce a woman into the whole sphere as well. And then suddenly John's like, well, what's she going to do now? Is she going to usurp me? And what's happening here? And how is Harry going to, he's invited her into the kind of whole sphere. That happens in that happens in the book I've just published now. So their relationship is both developing but also constantly changing. I mean, these are young men. Harry's 26, John's 20 at the beginning of this book. They don't really know who they are yet, never mind how they're going to relate to each other, and meanwhile relate to the wider world and this very changing world of being coroner. And then you introduce another person. So in the second book, we're introduced to Dr. Benton Reckitt, who becomes Harry's go-to medical witness. Highly eccentric character. I love Reckitt. I hadn't intended that he would be a major character. I'd intended him to be a kind of walk on, have a look at the body, walk off again. But he opened the door to Harry and John, and he just presented himself to me as a completely formed character. And I was like, oh, okay, right. And I've loved him, and he's a fixture now. So he is in the mix as well. And they've all got to try and negotiate their place in each investigation and their place in the kind of hierarchy of what's going on. So yeah, I mean, I can see that the relationship between Harry and John, and then between Harry and John and the other two, is going to be developing for some time yet. And that, I love that, because although obviously you've got to have a good plot for a crime novel, these are character-driven novels. I'm interested in the characters, and the plots serve them, not the other way around.
I'm listening to what you're saying, and other authors that I've been in conversation with, and bringing up that notion of, these characters that are now, they're real, they're formed to you. But do you find between books, because I know when you're in a book, then of course you're with them and it's, and it's developing. But when you give yourself a little bit of a breather, do you ever find yourself thinking, I wonder what they're doing? Or I wonder,
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. And not just so much what they're doing is, oh, what would they think about this? Or I'll be on a walk and I'll think, how would Harry see this, given his very peculiar form of blindness? And I'm always going around like this and trying to obliterate my central vision and see what you can actually see in your peripheral vision. People must think I'm a complete maniac, because I'm wandering around like this. So yeah, I'm inside both their heads quite a lot. I do occasionally forget that they're not real people. I do. It's quite sad, because they are incredibly real to me. I mean, people say, do you ever put real people in your books? And I don't, because I don't know real people anything like as well as I know these guys. Nothing like as well. I don't know anybody as well as I know Harry and John.
So, I love what you say, Alice. And Alice, I'm just really aware of time, and I wish we could. There's so much more that we need to talk about. It's really bad. So if you will forgive me, because I'm going to have to draw our conversation to a close, but I want to ask you about, because I know they're going to be announced quite soon, next month, um, being shortlisted for a CWA dagger, for the historical dagger. What has that done for you, and what does that mean to you? And even before, the results are known, has that changed, the way you view your writing and the way others are viewing your writing?
I think it hasn't changed the way I view my writing, because I've always taken it incredibly seriously. It's now validated it, because it's not just me and people who have always loved these books kind of having a love in. This is somebody completely objective who doesn't know me or anybody I know from Adam, has ranked this book alongside some of the great writers, the great current writers of historical crime fiction. And I cannot tell you, Jackie, how absolutely thrilled I am to be on that shortlist. It doesn't matter at this point who wins, because once you're on a shortlist, you could win. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
but I'm from on a kind of practical, not just what I feel point of view, but from the point of view of sales and getting it out there. I'm hoping that this will mean that more independent bookshops will be interested in the series, because I've worked really hard to get it into Welsh bookshops. I did a whole tour, as you know, of every independent bookshop in Wales last year, and I made fantastic relationships with Welsh bookshops, and they've been immensely supportive. But there are only 3 million people in Wales.
Yeah.
I need people in England to know about the Tyne Valley Coroner, and I kind of feel like the dagger shortlisting might just be the springboard to get the series better known. So it's a massive, massive deal for me, and I'm absolutely thrilled.
I mean, that I'm biased, and I, I'm not surprised that the book is there. I'm thrilled that it is. I'm not surprised. I really, really hope that circumstances, whatever the outcome, of the award, but I hope that the circumstances soon allow for a similar kind of thing that you did, going around those bookstores, for there to be the opportunity to do it in England, to do it in Scotland, so that, because I think, today what we're doing, it's what we can do now. But I do think, that sense of being out amongst people, letting people get to know you, being able to take your books around to those different places, I think it's really important. So, hopefully 2021 we'll see a different possibility for us to do that. But Alice, it just remains now for me to say to you, all the very best with everything. Thank you for coming on and talking to us. So your work is just so intriguing. It's almost like you get more for your money, because it's not just the mystery or the crime, but you get to learn so much more. And for me, it's a part of Wales that is dear to me as well. So thank you so much, and hope to see you very soon. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jackie. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thanks
A
for having me.
total pleasure. Bye for now.
Bye for now.
Bye.